Welcome to Two Fools for Christ. Today's episode is going to be on the liturgical rites of the Catholic Church. It's going to form a quasi-argument for why the Catholic Church is the true church because of its attitude towards its separated brethren and how it incorporates them within its own communion and within its own juridical structures. Only the Catholic Church possesses all the liturgical rites that were established in the apostolic age. In recent videos, we've been talking and using a lot a particular map that expresses the geographical composition of the church in the Roman Empire. And this has formed the basis of our understanding of how the Catholic Church is truly composed within a Patriarchate of Rome, which constitutes what we call the Latin Rite of the Church, and then the various other Eastern Patriarchates, which represent their own theological schools and their own liturgical rites. We'll have a quick overview of this map once more, which I will put up on the screen right now. And what we can see in this map is that in the western half of the Roman Empire was what we call the Patriarchate of the Bishop of Rome, and all of that is in what we call the Latin Rite of the Church. Now, this was formed of many various dioceses, including the North African churches, the Spanish churches, the Gallican churches of France, and the English churches in the Britons, and then mainly the Italian churches within the country of Italy. And this formed the foremost patriarchate of the Catholic Church. The second most significant prelate of the church was the Patriarch of Alexandria. And this was in the Patriarchate located in the eastern half of North Africa. Okay, think of the Egyptian Empire. It's in orange on the screen there. And Alexandria was a prominent city in the Roman Empire, and its bishop, who descends from the Apostle Mark. St. Peter sent Mark there to Alexandria to establish the church, was traditionally recognized as the second most important bishop in the entire Catholic Church, and that is why he was given the title Pope, as well as the Bishop of Rome. After that was Antioch, which is which is wedged between the Patriarchates of Constantinople and Jerusalem, and it is in what was historically the Syrian province of Rome. And it was the capital of it, the Patriarchal See, was the famous city of Antioch, which was established as the capital of the Seleucid Empire. After that was Jerusalem, where St. James was bishop, and then Constantinople. And we see within what exists in modern day Catholicism about 23 or so Eastern Catholic rites, which descend from these four and more Eastern Patriarchates. See, those four Eastern Patriarchs we just discussed are the foremost prominent. We also have some that are outside of the Roman Empire, like the Armenians, who actually converted the Armenian Empire before Rome actually converted to become officially Catholic. And so all of Christianity is expressed within these various liturgical rites that the apostles established. See, it could have been perfectly within the authority and intention of our Lord to establish one universal rite of worship within his church. For example, the Lord expressed one mode of worship to the Jewish people, and yet the apostles, commissioned by our Lord, saw it fit to establish unique rites in the various churches. And this meant that these rites became expressions of these Christian people's worship to the one true God, and it became reflective of their cultural identity, of their particular racial traits, because the Lord has willed the plurality of races, each having their own strengths to express different aspects of his greatness. And so these are then reflected within the theological schools and the liturgical rites of the church. Now, over time, various schisms split these apart. Some of these schisms have died. For example, the schism of the Donatists, the schism and heresy of the Arians, they've withered away. We don't have prominent Arian descendants and Arian priests and bishops today. They're gone. Nevertheless, unfortunately, some schisms have persisted. And so, an overview of the history of this would be that at the Third Ecumenical Council, we have the first of what remains or what continues today as a schism, which was the deposition and anathematization of the Patriarch of Constantinople known as Nestorius. And he went eastwards, and from there, what is now called the Assyrian Church of the East, and a breakaway from the Assyrian Church of the East, known as the Ancient Church of the East, exist as descendants of the exiled Nestorius and the churches that received him and went with him in the schism. Then we have the block of Christian churches which split after the Fourth Ecumenical Council at Chalcedon. These were traditionally known as monophysites. They are now often refer to themselves as Miaphysites, and these were led by the Patriarch of Alexandria, who at the time was Dioscorus. Now, the church deposed Dioscorus and put a successor in his place, but nevertheless, unfortunately, again, this schism solidified in the monophysite block / Miaphysite block, which is now headed by the Patriarch of the Coptic Orthodox Church in Alexandria, and those rites and churches that are in communion with him, which include the Ethiopian Church, and I believe the Armenians are now also entered into communion with them as well. And so you have that block of what is commonly referred to as Oriental Orthodoxy. And so these are characterized by their rejection of the Fourth Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon and their acceptance of what they consider to be the Fourth Ecumenical Council, which is the Second Council of Ephesus. And so within them, you have also what are called the Syriac, the Jacobites, or traditionally the Syriac Orthodox. You have the Armenians, and you have the Coptics, including the Ethiopians. And so that block of Christians incorporates the next schism. And then we have what is traditionally dubbed the Great Schism, and what many narrative forms of history is going to tell you was the first major schism. It wasn't. We've already just established that there was the Assyrian Church of the East, and now the Monophysite block, which is, as you can see, quite large, which involved the Patriarch of Alexandria and what a division in Antioch, such that Antioch never healed. You had a line that extends from Severus of Antioch, which the Monophysites venerate, and then the opposition to that, which was led by the monks of Beth Maroun, and eventually a Chalcedonian patriarch of Antioch. And so you have two major schisms, two major patriarchs on this side of the schism on the Monophysite side. And eventually you have the next major break, which is between what was the Church of Constantinople and the Antiochian and Alexandrian Chalcedonian patriarchs. So after the Monophysites left, the Catholics elected their own Alexandrian and Antiochian patriarchs, and those ones went into communion with Constantinople and went to schism with Rome. And so what we see is a large division of the church that is going to characterize our discussion now. And so what are the liturgical rites of these individual patriarchates, and what does this tell us, or how is this in any way an argument for the Catholic Church? So when we look at, let's go in order of the patriarchs. Firstly, you have the Patriarchate of Rome. He was the first of all the patriarchs, and in his patriarchal authority, we've discussed this before, but the Bishop of Rome wears various hats. He's the parish priest of the Church of John Lateran. He is the bishop of the Diocese of Rome, the Metropolitan of Italy, the Patriarch of the West, and the universal head of the church. And so in ecclesiology, we balance all of these hats at the same time. It's not appropriate to consider his parochial authority in his parish as totally absorbed into his bishopric, which is totally absorbed into his patriarchate. He has multiple hats. And this is important for ecclesiology because you denote the particular theological note of a statement by the intention of who he's addressing. So, for example, sometimes the Bishop of Rome is going to write to his priests as the Bishop of Rome, and it's addressed only to his priests. Sometimes it's addressed to the Italian bishops as metropolitan. Sometimes, like for example, what was initially Benedict XIV's bull on usury was initially addressed just to the Italian bishops, I believe. Sometimes he's writing only to the Western bishops, and then sometimes he writes as universal head of the Catholic Church. And that's why Vatican I stipulates that for something to be infallible, it has to be intended to be universally addressed. That only makes sense if we're talking about the Pope operating with various hats. And so now we're talking about the Bishop of Rome with his patriarchal hat. He is the patriarch of the Western Church. And the Western Church had various rites. Most commonly today, that is the Roman Rite. Now, the Roman Rite has two expressions today, which is an extraordinary aspect, but not totally without precedent, as we will see. But that is the Novus Ordo, which is the Missal of 1969. And then you have what is now the Missal of 1962, which is what is commonly referred to as the Latin Mass, sometimes known as the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite, which is effectively, which some argue is the continuation of the Tridentine Rite as put out by Pius V. So that's the Roman Rite. But again, it's called the Roman Rite because it's the liturgy of the Diocese of Rome. And this is key because the Bishop of Rome has had his liturgy adopted by many of the dioceses of the church. So most Roman Catholic churches, most Roman Catholic dioceses have the Roman Rite. But that's not the only rite in the West, and sometimes Roman Catholics don't actually realize this. There are other rites that existed in the Western Church. Some of these are rites that belong to their religious orders, but not exclusively, because prior to the Council of Trent and Pius V's liturgical reforms, there existed local liturgies within the West. See, the principal liturgist of a diocese is the bishop. He actually orders and establishes how liturgies are done in his diocese. And that's why when we go to the East, we'll see that many prominent bishops have liturgies named after them, because bishops were entitled to compose their own liturgies, and many of them did, both East and West. After a time, however, synods in both the East and the West eventually began to restrict the usage of various liturgical rites to standardize things, and this was culminated in the West at Trent, where Trent dissolved all liturgies less than 200 years old and required proof of antiquity, proof of its of a particular rite's existence for more than 200 years for it to be continued. And so in the West, you have various liturgies that were associated with the countries of Europe. For example, you have the Mozarabic rite, the Mozarabic rite, which was the rite of what was known as the Visigoths, eventually the Hispanics. So think of the rite of Spain, of Portugal. That's the Mozarabic rite. You also had the Ambrosian rite, which was the rite of the city of the Ambrosian rite was celebrated in Venice. The Patriarch of Venice, and that was his liturgy, and it descended from Ambrose himself. And so that was another rite within the Metropolitan of Italy. So this isn't even outside of the metropolitan authority of the Bishop of Rome. This was within Italy itself. And it wasn't Venice, it was in Milan. Archbishop of, it's the liturgical rite of Milan, not Venice, Milan. And it still exists today and it can still be celebrated in Milan today. You have other rites. For example, the Sarum rite, which descends from the Diocese of Salisbury in England. You have the Gallic rite, belongs to the French people. And so, like, you had a rite that was associated with the English people, another rite with the French, some with the Spanish. And so you could see that liturgical expression in the West was pluralistic and ordered towards the various peoples of Europe. Now, after the French Revolution, the French clergy that entered to reform France following the massacre of its people adopted heavily the use of the Tridentine rite, the Rite of Trent. You also eventually see the dwindling away of the various rites that are located with or associated with dioceses. So, for example, the Sarum rite of Salisbury, the Mozarabic rite of Spain. You have these things started to dwindle away as liturgical uniformity became common in the diocese among the diocesan clergy of the Western Patriarchate. But what still remained for a time was all the various liturgical rites associated with the Western religious orders. So, for example, the Dominicans have the rite of the order of preachers, something which, if you're blessed, like I have been, is something that you can actually experience regularly if you still know Dominicans that are capable of serving it. And this, like it sounds, is the rite of the Dominican order as celebrated by St. Thomas and St. Dominic. And it has its own peculiarity. It's a Latin Mass, but it has its own unique aspects, its own unique structure. That, for example, one aspect that's unique is that the offertory is the first thing the priest does when he ascends the altar. And after the offertory is done, he comes down to do the prayers at the foot of the altar. Things like that are unique differences between the rite of the order of preachers and the rite of the Bishop of Rome, which is the Roman rite. You have other religious orders, for example, like the Benedictines, who always just used the local liturgy, which is the Roman rite now, but had their own office. But, for example, you also have the Carthusians, who have their own rite. They have the Carthusian rite. You had the Carmelites had their own rite. It was known as the Rite of the Holy Sepulchre. And it was adopted by the Reformed Carmelites of St. John of the Cross right after Trent. St. John of the Cross actually didn't want to adopt it. He wanted to preserve the original rite of the Carmelite order, but they voted to actually adopt the Roman rite. And so the Reformed displaced Carmelites have let go of their traditional rite at Trent, but the old observant Carmelites, the original, the one that didn't branch off with John of the Cross, the unreformed Carmelites, actually possessed the use of the Carmelite rite, the rite of the Holy Sepulchre, all the way up to Vatican II. And they actually gave it up for the novice order. So that's an example now of an instance where the liturgical rites have persisted, like the Dominican rite and the Carthusian rite, but in the case of the Carmelites, it's withered away. And so in the Roman rite today, you still have a lot of these minor rites that can be celebrated in smaller circumstances. Nevertheless, most of the religious orders and the dioceses have adopted the Roman rite, so the rite of the Diocese of Rome, as their normative rite. Even the Dominicans have. Their normative rite is the Roman rite. And so in the West, we see actually by the time of Vatican II, the West has more or less achieved, and that sense of achieved is can be positive or negative depending on your own criteria of whether or not you value liturgical diversity or you think that uniformity is better. But it was a natural growth towards, more or less, the establishment of a uniform expression of the Western liturgical rites. And this was never done in a stamping down manner. Rome never forced the Dominicans or forced the Carmelites to adopt the Tridentine rite, nor did Rome force the local diocese to do so either, provided that they were able to show antiquity of up to 200 years. What Rome was trying to avoid at Trent was the incessant creation of new rites, which became a problem. So that's the rite of the West. That's the Western rite right there. Now, what about the Alexandrian rite? So the Alexandrian Patriarchate, established by the Apostle Mark at the directive of Blessed Peter, it's considered a Petrine see by Leo the Great and all the other great bishops of Rome in the early church. They viewed Alexandria as Petrine because it was established by the interpreter of St. Peter, which was Mark the Apostle. And so what we have here is the Alexandrian rite. Coptic rite is what it's often referred to today. It has two aspects to the Alexandrian rite. There's the Coptic rite and the Ge'ez or Ge'ez rite of Ethiopia, which is its own language, which is used by the Tahawido and other aspects of the Ethiopian rite. Not something that I'm too familiar with and not something I know how to pronounce very well. But when it comes to the Coptic rite, the Alexandrian rite itself, it's a little bit clearer. So what the Alexandrian rite normatively uses is the liturgy of Saint Basil. Now, Saint Basil was the bishop of Caesarea, and we know, if you have a look at the map right now, that's actually within the geographical diocese of Constantinople. Towards the right, if you look right above the border of Antioch, it's you've got Iconium on the left, Tyana, Caesarea is kind of in the middle. You've got Sebastia above it. And so Caesarea was there. St. Basil was the bishop of there, but he composed what is called the Liturgy of St. Basil. And that is the normative rite of the Coptic Church. And what do I mean normative? In that some of the Eastern rites, like the Byzantines and the Alexandrians, actually use more than one liturgy throughout the year. They have one that they use most often. It's kind of like the default rite. Then they have a couple of others that they pull out for special occasions. And it might be a bit foreign because in the Roman rite, there's a massive debate going on right now of how certain priests are both celebrating the Novus Ordo and the Latin Mass, and that's seen as weird. But historically, that's not without precedence. Historically, it is with precedence for even a single diocese or a rite itself to possess more than one liturgy for more than one use. And so in Alexandria, to this day at least, the Coptic rite predominantly uses the liturgy of Saint Basil of Caesarea. After Saint Basil, they do use Saint Gregory of Nazianzus throughout the year. Now, he was Bishop of Constantinople. And sometimes they use the liturgy of Saint Cyril of Alexandria, who is, they call him, Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Sometimes they use his liturgy as well, but more often than not, it's used in parts these days. It's not often said it's in its entirety. Now, this is the liturgies. These are the set of liturgies used by the Alexandrians or / Coptic Orthodox and the Coptic Catholics. So the Catholics, the Coptics, the Alexandrians in communion with Rome, they also use the same rites as their Orthodox brethren. Now, these days, it also has what is traditionally the liturgy of Mark the Evangelist, so the Apostle. But that, again, is not a liturgy celebrated from my understanding in its entirety. It has elements of his liturgy that has been derived, but it's not a liturgy from my understanding that is commonly said individually. I might be wrong. If you know if it is, that would be good. I've never seen it. But normally now their liturgy is the liturgy of Saint Basil. That's their main liturgy. And so the usages of Saint Cyril of Alexandria and Saint Mark the Apostle is one that is more incorporated in its aspects within the later developed liturgies. So that's the Coptic Church. The next is the liturgy of Antioch. Now, the liturgy of the Church of Antioch is normally what we call the West Syriac Rite. So there are two. So the Syriac tradition is the tradition of the Syrian province of Rome, referring to the Syro-Phoenician people of that province. Now, they spoke in the dialect of Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, the language that our Lord spoke in. And this involved Antioch as its patriarchate, but also it extends out eastwards into Edessa and Nisibis and other more rural aspects of this province. Now, there's a reason why there exists a division between the East and the West Syriac rites, and partially that belongs to the fact that during the time of the early church, the major metropolitan cities in, for example, Alexandria, in Antioch, in Jerusalem, in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, basically, spoke Greek. That's why you often hear the great Antiochian theologians and Alexandrian theologians referred to as, or Jerusalem theologians referred to as Greek fathers. Not because they're representative of Byzantine thought, but because they wrote in Greek. That's why. And so you have to conceptualize that within Antioch, the major patriarchal city of Antioch had a strong, heavy Greek influence. While the rural cities, the rural towns, were more Syriac. And we see this influence even come into somebody like, say, Ephraim the Syrian, who, when he moved from I think Nisibis, because his bishop was Jacob of Nisibis, when he moved to Edessa following the giving over of that territory to the Persians, we see Greek elements start to come into his writing. And so there is a distinction there. And so within the East and the West Syriac rites, the Patriarchate of Antioch was normally the liturgical rites associated with it are what we call the West Syriac Rite / Liturgy of St. James. Now, the Liturgy of St. James is the liturgy that was established in Jerusalem by the Apostle St. James himself. It is traditionally considered the oldest of all the liturgies. Now, this liturgy made its way into Antioch. There is a question of whether or not the liturgy of St. Basil was replaced by the liturgy of St. James in Antioch, but the liturgy of St. James is the rite of the Antiochian church there. And it's the rite that is adopted by the Syriac Orthodox, what are often called the Jacobites. Now, these were the ones who sided with the Coptic Orthodox at the schism, at the Monophysite schism that occurred after the Fourth Ecumenical Council at Chalcedon. The Syriac Orthodox rites worship according to the liturgy of St. James. So does Jerusalem, being the descendant of the blessed James himself, who was the first bishop of Jerusalem. And so that is the traditional liturgy of Antioch and Jerusalem. This is where things start to get a little bit complicated, because now we're going to discuss the Byzantine Rite. Now, the Byzantine Rite is the rite of Constantinople, and it's commonly associated with the Eastern Orthodox / the Melkites, Greek Catholics, Ukrainian Catholics, and all the other like Greek Catholic referring to the Byzantine Rite, like the Ruthenians and all of them who celebrate according to the Byzantine tradition. Now, the Byzantine tradition, and this is where things get a little bit complicated, is predominantly the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. On most days, you will hear the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which, to my understanding, was just a development of the liturgy of St. Basil. Now, the Eastern Orthodox which, remember, all the Eastern Orthodox churches are Byzantine. Now they are. The Eastern Orthodox / Byzantine Catholic rites will, on special occasions, have the Liturgy of St. Basil. Now, the Liturgy of St. Basil predates the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. It's the normative rite of Alexandria, and they will say that about 10 times a year, according to feast days, particular feast days. They will also say the Liturgy of St. James twice a year. Now, this was the custom of the Church of Constantinople. But what ends up happening is that Emperor Justinian II, in the early 8th century or late 7th century, tries to Byzantify all the rites. In other words, we've had this monophysite crisis going on for a long time, and they've tried to bring back these monophysites into communion through some type of compromised theological doctrine, and that's caused a lot of problems. And so Emperor Justinian II had the idea to convert all the Eastern rites, the Church of Antioch, the Church of Jerusalem, and the Church of Alexandria, that was Chalcedonian, into adopting the Byzantine rite. And so if anyone's familiar with the Quintisex Council, the Council of Trullo, and the problems associated with that era of councils, this was Constantinople really throwing their body weight around on all the other churches, including Rome, to enforce and universalize Greek customs and Greek liturgies. So to Byzantify the Eastern rites and to make the Greek customs of fasting and penance normative, not just in the East, but also in the West. Now, Rome heavily pushed back on this. And so did certain Easterners. So, for example, this is where the Maronites distinguished themselves from the other Chalcedonian Christians in Antioch. Because remember, in Antioch, where the rite was the West Syriac rite, the liturgy was of St. James, but in the major cities, there was a far heavier Greek culture, and this Greek culture was receptive towards the Byzantification of the Antiochian church. And so the those who were associated in the major cities, who were loyal to the kings, also known as the kingsmen, who are Melkites, that's what Melkite means, were more than ready to adopt the Byzantine liturgy. Most of the rural Syriac Christians were monophysite heretics, except for the monasteries around the monastery of St. Maroun. And this is when these rural Syriac Chalcedonian Christians said, no, we're not doing that. We're not Byzantifying. The Antiochian church is the liturgy of St. James, and so we're keeping that. Now, Emperor Justinian II, in his wisdom, decides to destroy the monasteries, kills 500 monks, and this results in a major battle in modern-day Amun, in Amun in modern-day Lebanon, and in that battle, the Maronites won, defeated the Byzantines, preserved their rights. But what ends up happening is that, for the most part, in the Chalcedonian East, it was pretty successful. Justinian II basically Byzantified the entire Chalcedonian East, such that the original liturgies were now following the Byzantine rite. Now, an Eastern Orthodox might respond and say, well, we still have the liturgy of St. James, it's only twice a year. But what formally constitutes a liturgical rite? Is it the existence of their archaic liturgies, which they parade out once or twice a year? Or is it actually the proper and full immersion into the rite? So we see with the Coptic Orthodox and the Coptic Catholics, they've preserved the proportionate uses of their various liturgies. St. Basil being the normative way, and St. Gregory, St. Cyril, and St. Mark being used on special occasions or in one part or another contained within the other rites. They've maintained that traditional usage. While in Antioch, they went from being exclusively liturgy of St. James to only using it twice a year. They completely Byzantified and let their rite fall into their own liturgy fall into obscurity. And so even in Jerusalem, you have the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem, where it's the Greek Orthodox Byzantine usage of liturgies, which again is predominantly St. John Chrysostom, on special occasions St. Basil, and twice a year St. James. And so we see in the Eastern Orthodox blocks of churches, it's all been universally Byzantified. And so the rite should be distinguished from the liturgy in that the rite is reflective of the usage of the liturgies, plural. The Coptic rite uses the liturgy of St. Basil, so does the Byzantine rite. But what's characteristic of the Byzantine rite is that its normative rite isn't St. Basil, while the Coptic rite's normative rite, liturgy, is St. Basil. So it's not simply to go one for one between a rite and the liturgy said. It is actually the proportionate use of the liturgy that constitutes the character of a rite. And so in Antioch, these Antiochian Eastern Orthodox Christians are Byzantine. Antioch was never Byzantine. Never was. The liturgies of Antioch in the West Syriac tradition is the liturgy of St. James. Now, what are the other rites? Let's extend out eastwards a little bit. The Armenians are a little bit confusing, to be honest. It's kind of St. Basil, but the Armenians have been tampered. Don't want to say tampered, but they've liturgically revised themselves. Not just the Catholic aspects, but broadly as a universal in their own Orthodox church, were heavily influenced by their Latin missionaries during the second half of the second millennia, and they changed their aspects. So generally it's considered characteristic of St. Basil's liturgy, but it's not strictly St. Basil's liturgy. It's been modified. The Assyrians, who descend from Nestorius's excommunication and the churches that followed him, which is the far east. We're talking not just like Antioch and Jerusalem, we're talking like past Edessa, Nisibis, that way, which was eventually incorporated into like the Persian Empire. We're talking of like Iraq regions. These Christians are what we call the East Syriac Rite. What's the East Syriac Rite? Well, the East Syriac Rite uses three main anaphoras. What's an anaphora? An anaphora, the closest way I could explain it would be like an offertory prayer / Eucharistic prayer. So to those Roman Catholic listeners, you know how in the novice order, unlike the Latin Mass, when the priest gets to the Eucharistic liturgy, the liturgy of the Eucharist, he has three options: Eucharistic prayer 1, 2, and 3, which are all rather similar, but like switched up order and prayer lengths of the prayers around the communion. So an anaphora is basically that. Now, the Eastern rites have various anaphoras depending on the rite. See, the Assyrians have three major anaphoras. The Maronites have 72. So you can see how broad it is. And so like for the Maronites, we've got like the anaphora of the 12 apostles, or anaphora of St. Peter, anaphora of Pope Sixtus, anaphora of St. John Chrysostom. So all these Eucharistic prayers composed in antiquity by the various people it's attributed to. Whether or not they were is a question for liturgists and liturgical historians, not something I'm too bothered by. But the idea is that, okay, well, the anaphora of the 12 apostles was written by the 12 apostles. Anaphora of St. Sixtus by St. Sixtus. Now, the three anaphoras of the Assyrian churches are characteristics of their own liturgy. And so the major one is the anaphora of the holy apostles, Saints Adai and Mari, who are seen as part of Christ's initial 70 disciples. Christ had 12 apostles and 70 disciples who he sent out 2 by 2. And after the resurrection, Adai and Mari went far east and they established the churches there, which are associated with St. Thomas. And so this is also a controversial liturgy to anybody who's into sacramentology, because this is the liturgy that famously doesn't have the words of consecration in it, and yet it's still seen as a valid liturgy. If you're interested in that, there is a good chapter in Lawrence Feingold's book on the Eucharist on the liturgy of Adai and Mari, or you can just read what the Vatican put out regarding its validity. I think that was done during the pontificate of JP2, but put out by Benedict. I'm not sure. Either way, this is it's a famous liturgy, so to speak, in sacramentology. That's their main one. They also have the, and this is under air quotes, the anaphora of Mar Nestorius and Mar Theodore of Mopsuestia, who are both controversial figures. Nestorius was again anathematized and deposed at the third ecumenical council, and Theodore, the interpreter slash Theodore of Mopsuestia, was condemned at the fifth ecumenical council by Emperor Justinian I and Pope Vigilius. And so that controversial, actually all three anaphoras are controversial when you think about it when it comes to the Assyrians. Nevertheless, the anaphora of Mar Adai and Mari are used by the Assyrian Church of the East, the ancient Church of the East, and the Chaldean Catholics. The Chaldean Catholics, however, have the words of consecrations added into it. Even though it's valid without it, that's still added into it when it's done in Catholic communion, which is fair enough. The other two, I hope they're not celebrated, but you got to ask the Chaldeans. And so those are the Far East liturgies. You also have the liturgies of the Syria-Malabar, the Malankari churches, and they are also generally seen as West Syriac, so that would be Liturgy of St. James in the West Syriac tradition, as opposed to the East Syriac tradition, which is Adai and Mari. And so that's a big overview of all the various liturgical rites in the church, all the various Western ones, all the various Eastern ones. And as you can see, if you were to walk into like 95% of Catholic parishes, maybe more, you're going to be seeing the liturgy of the Diocese of Rome, the Roman Rite liturgy. You're rarely going to stumble into some Western monastic order or some Western religious order or some obscure parish in France or Lyons or in Spain or Milan, where you're going to have one of the local ancient customs celebrated. So most parishes you're going to walk into, you're going to experience the Roman Rite, which is the liturgy of the Bishop of Rome. Nevertheless, we can see that there's a massive plurality here. And why is this the case? Well, in God's salvific plan, He's ordained that the liturgical rites of the church be an expression of His people, His elect, the ones that He's chosen to pull into His flock. And so it's natural, it remains a natural inclination for us to want to worship in the manner of our fathers. Because let's just be frank about it. You might be a Roman Catholic. You might be an American or an English or a Spanish. If you're listening to this, you're probably American or English or Australian. And you have a particular tradition and culture that you naturally feel patriotic to love. You love your country, you love your people, you love the people that brought you onto this earth, and you feel at home in the Roman Rite, as you should. That's rightly ordered. That's healthy, because it's a two-way street. The Roman Rite and the Western rites, broadly speaking, formed the European Catholic people. And in turn, the European Catholic people formed the liturgy over time with various liturgical additions. And so you ought to feel at home in your tradition. And so the Byzantine Rite, the liturgy of St. James or St. Basil, St. Gregory or St. Cyril or Mar Adai and Mari might be something that excites you. The novelty of it will even make you sometimes think that it's more beautiful than the Roman Rite for, one reason or another. But in the long run, you're going to feel at home in the Roman Rite because that is your people. And likewise, in the Maronite Rite, or the Byzantine Rite, or the Alexandrian Rite, or the Rite of Jerusalem, or the Rite of the Far East, that can be said of the people too. You can objectively appreciate the beauty of other rites, but if you've been formed in your culture, you're patriotic about your people, you will feel that the liturgical rites you have feel like home because they're expressive of your people's culture, and your culture is expressive of the liturgical rite handed to you by your fathers in the faith. If you're Alexandrian, the gospel traveled from St. Peter on the day of the resurrection to the blessed apostle Mark to Alexandria, through all the great Alexandrian fathers of Athanasius and all the desert fathers like Abba Sisoes, and it travels through the great pillars of orthodoxy like St. Cyril of Alexandria to be received into your hand in this time and in this age. And so it's only natural that you wish to worship in the rites of your fathers. Likewise, if you're Antiochian, you receive the tradition passed through Blessed Peter to Ignatius and Evodius and to all the great martyrs and saints of your era, whether it's St. Christina of Tyre, the martyr, or, St. Habib the deacon, St. Ephraim the Syrian to St. Isaac the Syrian, whatever it is, even St. John Chrysostom who came from Antioch. And so you're going to feel at home there. And there is a natural obligation that we all owe to our own respective rites. And so even though we might study and love and even attend other liturgies in a manner that makes us more Catholic, because we fall in love with other Catholic rites, and it balances out our liturgical preferences, and it helps us to think in the way that the church thinks. All of these things might be true, but you're still going to have a favoritism naturally, or there ought to be, in a rightly ordered and healthy relationship with your own patrimony, a natural affection that is developed to your own right. And so what does this say about the Catholic Church? I said at the beginning that this is going to form, after the lecture, so to speak, of all the liturgical rites, this was going to form as a quasi-argument for the Catholic Church. Now, I'm going to preface that it's quasi because, strictly speaking, the liturgical rites are not an essential element of the Church's identity. So if the entire East were to go into schism with Rome, Rome is still the true Church. If the entire West, and I mean this, if all of Spain and North Africa, England, like England did, France, the Eastern Slavic countries, if they were to all go, all of them, in one big hit, schism, and Rome is by itself only communion with the East, or even Rome is just by itself as its own diocese, none of this necessarily proves the church to be defective just because it loses the various other Western rites or Eastern rites, or even strictly speaking, if Rome were to reform its own rite. The loss of any of the rites of antiquity don't in themselves prove some indefectibility of the church. So that's not what I'm arguing for. But what I will say is that traditionally, let's think about how schisms were handled. Schisms weren't handled by individuals, converting individuals to your own right. Schisms were handled by reincorporating the lost shepherds who brought with them their lost sheep and folds into the true church. Now, only one church has had this attitude throughout history. That's the Bishop of Rome. Only in establishing communion has it been done and intended to be done at a church level. Now, and also with direct respect for the rights of those particular churches. Why is this important? Well, let's consider these various things. If you are a Roman Catholic or a Roman or a Western Christian, and you're trying to discern the true church and you believe that to be Eastern Orthodoxy, then you are compelled to practice according to the tradition of the Byzantine Rite. There is no other option. The Byzantine Rite is the universal expression of spirituality in the Eastern Orthodox West, whether you go Russian, Georgian, Greek, Antiochian, Jerusalem, Alexandria, even when it wasn't the traditional rite of those regions, you are forced to become Byzantine. You must forsake the manner in which you worshipped and your ancestors worshipped for centuries to then come under the fold of another shepherd in another rite. Likewise, if you wish to be Alexandrian and you believe that the monophysites / Miaphysites, they prefer to be called Miaphysites, so I should call them that. Let's say you want to become Coptic Orthodox or Syriac Orthodox, you want to become Oriental Orthodox then. You have to forsake the Byzantine rite or the Roman rite to become Coptic or Syriac. There's just one or two options. Only within the Catholic Church does the Latin rite, the Byzantine rite, the West Syriac rite, the East Syriac rite, the Alexandrian Coptic rite, and the rite of Jerusalem all exist in their entirety, such that any Christian who wishes to enter the true Church of God does not have a competing notion between his natural obligations, which is naturally ordered obligation to want to remain in the culture and worship in the manner of his fathers, and at the same time follow the divine precept of being within the true Church of Christ. Those things are not in competition in the Catholic Church. And that is because the Catholic Church approaches the other rites as legitimate goods that must be preserved. They must be. Constantinople, over centuries, destroyed the West Syriac rite of the Chalcedonian Antiochian Christians that were in communion with them. I'm sorry, but I don't mean to attack other rites, but if you're a Lebanese Antiochian Orthodox Christian and you attend the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, you are not worshipping in the manner of your fathers. You are not. You are Greek. You have been Hellenized to the point that your own tradition is something that you pretend, like, that you participate in 2 times a year. When the liturgy of St. James is brought out almost like a cot out of it, like as if it's an exhumed body to be, represented on 2 occasions in the year, when it's the Church of Antioch. Likewise, the Church of Jerusalem. I mean, many times people want to use, the argument that the churches in the East are, the Eastern Orthodox blocks are nationalistic churches, and I don't actually think that's a very good argument. If only the Eastern Orthodox churches preserved the rights of the nations that the borders of their diocese were formed around. It's almost as if God ordered that these churches, the Syriac churches of the West and the East, are reflective of peoples, of nation peoples. So it's not a problem that there are national characteristics or identities to the Eastern and Western churches. That is a modern pseudo-intellectual argument against the Eastern Orthodox Church, and Catholics need to just drop it entirely. But what is true, however, is that in the Eastern Orthodox bloc of churches, the Christians of Jerusalem and the Christians of Antioch do not worship within their traditions. There are even open hostilities on account of this. Palestinian and Jordanian Eastern Orthodox Christians continually upset for centuries over the fact that their bishop is Greek Orthodox and Byzantine. Now, obviously, in the Catholic Church, we don't really care when it comes to what country you're from, so to speak, but it does pose a problem when we're talking about an entirely different expression, that the Arabian Christians, the Jerusalem Patriarchate, do not have a manner of worship reflective of their tradition, that they cannot worship in the according to the church fathers that they descend from. But the Catholic Church allows for that, because the Catholic Church has preserved all the liturgical rites of the church. Same thing within the Alexandrian Patriarchate. The Alexandrian Patriarch, at least internally, has not destroyed any other rites the way that the Church of Constantinople did under Justinian II, which did destroy the West Syriac rite of their communions. That's just a fact. It's just a fact. Well, in Alexandria, at least they preserve their own traditions, but it only remains again of the Coptic rite. To become Coptic Orthodox or Oriental Orthodox means that you have to come into communion either with the Syriac Orthodox or the West Syriac tradition of the Liturgy of St. James, or the Coptic Orthodox communion of the Coptic rite of the Liturgy of St. Basil, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Cyril and Mark in Alexandria. But again, this communion lacks a universality of the church's rites, such that if you were born Armenian or you're born Greek or you're born Latin, you must forsake the rites of your fathers in the faith. Fathers in the faith, I'm talking about. The rites of the Latin fathers, if you're Latin, or the rites of the Greek fathers, if you're Greek, or the rites of the Syriac fathers, if you're Syriac, to enter in communion with another church and to adopt the culture and beliefs of another rite. Now, as you can see, this is a quasi-argument, because strictly speaking, there were times in the church where there wasn't a universality of the liturgical rites. So you might be thinking, what's the point? What's the point of making any of this? The point is that ask yourself, which church, which communion of churches still behaves and operates in a manner as if it seeks to preserve the original unity of the church. And when you consider it along that element, there's only one church that has preserved that original ideal, and that is the Catholic Church in communion with the Bishop of Rome.